14 billion rubles. That's what the Soviet Union spent developing the MiG-25 Foxbat, an interceptor purpose-built to kill a single American bomber. So, why did America kill that bomber first? What pushed the United States Air Force to walk away from the fastest, highest-flying strategic bomber ever constructed? And what did the Soviets do with a fighter that no longer had a reason to exist? In 1958, Soviet military intelligence flagged a North American Aviation project designated WS-108. The details trickling out of American trade journals and congressional testimony described something that shouldn't have been possible. A six-engine bomber cruising at Mach 3, 70,000 feet. Faster than any interceptor in the Soviet inventory, flying above every surface-to-air missile they owned. The Kremlin's response landed on Artem Mikoyan's desk before the Americans had even bent metal. Build something that can catch it and reach it before Moscow disappears. The directive carried the weight of national survival. A Mach 3 bomber carrying thermonuclear weapons meant Moscow had roughly 11 minutes of warning. Maybe less. Mikoyan's bureau started drawing what became the Ye-155 prototype in 1961. The engineering constraints bordered on absurd. They needed an aircraft that could sustain Mach 2.8 above 65,000 feet, hold that speed long enough to execute an intercept, and carry missiles large enough to destroy a bomber the size of a small building. Soviet metallurgy couldn't produce titanium airframes at scale the way Lockheed could, so Mikoyan's team welded the Foxbat primarily from nickel steel. The airframe weighed 20,000 kilograms empty. That's a lot of interceptor to push past Mach 2.8. These Cold War engineering battles, the decisions, the trade-offs, the machines that never got to prove themselves, the budgets burned on threats that evaporated, they fade a little more every year. If you want them to keep showing up in your feed, a like and subscribe goes further than you'd think. Drop a comment if you already know how this story ends. The Soviet panic was rational. The XB-70 Valkyrie wasn't a paper airplane. North American Aviation built two flying prototypes. Ship number 1 flew on September 21, 1964, out of Palmdale, California. Test pilot Al White pushed it past Mach 3 on October 14th of that year. At that speed, the aircraft rode its own shockwave, a phenomenon called compression lift that North Americans' engineers had figured out how to exploit for free aerodynamic efficiency. The delta wing and its folding wingtips trapped a cushion of high-pressure air beneath the fuselage. No other bomber in history had done anything like it. The Soviets tracked every test flight. KGB technical intelligence reports from '65 describe the Valkyrie's performance with a word that translates roughly as exceptional. Their word, pulled from a document declassified in 2004. So Mikoyan kept building, hundreds of engineers, new factories in Gorky, tooling for mass production of an interceptor fleet sized to cover the entire northern frontier. The MiG-25 first flew in 1964, the same year the Valkyrie did. By then, the bomber it existed to kill already had a death sentence. The men in Washington had decided the Valkyrie's future months earlier, and the reasons had nothing to do with Soviet fighters. Curtis LeMay slammed his fist on the table during a 1954 budget meeting and told the room that Strategic Air Command needed a bomber the Soviets could never touch. He didn't want a faster B-52 or an incremental improvement. He wanted something that rendered Soviet air defense obsolete in a single leap, an aircraft that flew so high and so fast that interception became a physics problem Moscow couldn't solve. LeMay ran SAC like a man who believed nuclear war could start on any Tuesday. His bomber crews trained for one-way missions into Soviet airspace, and he measured their survival in minutes past the border. The B-52 entering service in 1955 could reach the Soviet Union, but couldn't outrun what waited there. MiG-17s swarmed at medium altitude. SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, the same type that would later knock down France's Gary Powers, covered the approaches to every major target. LeMay's bombers needed to fly above 60,000 feet at speeds exceeding Mach 2.5 just to shift the odds from suicidal to survivable. The Air Force formalized this obsession in October 1954 as Weapons System 110A. The requirement read like science fiction: a chemically fueled bomber with intercontinental range, capable of sustained supersonic cruise at extreme altitude, carrying a thermonuclear payload to targets deep inside the Soviet Union. 6 major contractors submitted proposals. Boeing offered a massive delta wing design. North American Aviation, fresh off the F-100 Super Sabre program, proposed something more radical. North American's chief designer, Harrison Storms, built his concept around compression lift. At Mach 3, the shockwave generated beneath a properly shaped aircraft creates a region of high-pressure air that acts like an invisible ramp. Storms designed a fuselage that sat on top of this pressure field, essentially surfing its own sonic boom. The wingtips folded downward at high speed to trap the shockwave and increase lift by 30% without burning a single additional pound of fuel. "We didn't just want to go fast," Storms told an engineering conference in 1962. "We wanted to make speed pay for itself." The Air Force picked North American in December 1957. What Storms and his team designed over the next 3 years at the Inglewood plant in Los Angeles defied every convention in bomber engineering. 6 General Electric Y.J. 93 turbojet engines clustered in a single nacelle beneath the rear fuselage, each producing 30,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner. The engines ran on JP6 fuel, a special high flashpoint kerosene developed specifically for the program because standard jet fuel would have boiled in the fuel tanks at Mach 3 skin temperatures. Those temperatures reached 600 degrees Fahrenheit along the leading edges. The aircraft stretched 185 feet from nose to tail, longer than a B-29 by 40 feet, and carried a crew of 2 seated in individual escape capsules that could eject at any speed up to Mach 3. The structural challenges alone consumed 4 years of testing. Honeycomb sandwich panels of stainless steel and brazed titanium formed the skin. North American developed new welding techniques that didn't exist when the contract started. The inlet system for the 6 engines required movable ramps that adjusted geometry dozens of times per second to manage airflow at triple the speed of sound. A single inlet on start, where the supersonic shockwave gets expelled forward out of the engine intake, could yaw the aircraft violently enough to tear it apart. So, what did all this engineering buy? At cruise, the Valkyrie hit Mach 3.08 at 70,000 feet. That translates to 2,056 miles per hour. A surface-to-air missile launched from directly below needed roughly 90 seconds to reach that altitude. During those 90 seconds, the Valkyrie covered 50 miles. The intercept geometry became nearly impossible for anything in the Soviet inventory circa 1960. The program cost ran to $1.5 billion by 1961, roughly $15 billion in today's money for 2 prototype aircraft and the research infrastructure behind them. North American employed 5,000 engineers on the project at peak staffing. Wind tunnel testing alone consumed over 5,000 hours across facilities at Langley, Ames, and the company's own tunnels in Inglewood. LeMay wanted 200 of them. A fleet of Mach 3 bombers dispersed across bases in the continental United States and forward deployed to Spain, Guam, Okinawa, all carrying multiple thermonuclear weapons, untouchable by anything the Soviets could put in the air. He came within 1 budget cycle of getting them. Then a 36-year-old defense intellectual from Harvard walked into the Pentagon and killed the whole thing. The conventional explanation is wrong. Most accounts credit the Minuteman ICBM with killing the Valkyrie, the argument that missiles made bombers obsolete. But the timeline doesn't support it. Minuteman didn't achieve initial operational capability until 1962, and Robert McNamara had already gutted the B-70 program in 1961. Something else broke the bomber's strategic logic before ICBMs were ready to replace it. That something happened on May 1, 1960, 38,000 feet above Sverdlovsk. Francis Gary Powers flew his U-2 on a route designated Operation Grand Slam, a transit from Peshawar, Pakistan, across the Soviet Union to Bodø, Norway. The CIA had run these missions for 4 years. 24 successful penetrations of Soviet airspace at altitudes above 65,000 feet where nothing could reach them. The SA-2 guideline missile had been deployed since 1957, but the CIA's analysts assessed its effective ceiling at 60,000 feet. Powers cruised at 70,000. The math worked until it didn't. An SA-2 detonated close enough to shear the tail section and send the U-2 tumbling. Powers ejected at 15,000 feet as the aircraft broke apart around him. The Soviets recovered wreckage, camera equipment, the pilot himself. Khrushchev waited 2 weeks to reveal they had him alive, a piece of diplomatic theater that humiliated Eisenhower at the Paris summit and collapsed four-power détente negotiations overnight. But inside the Pentagon, the fallout hit differently. The shoot-down didn't just embarrass the intelligence community. It demolished a core assumption that undergirded every high-altitude penetration concept in the American arsenal, including the B-70. Look at the numbers. The SA-2 that hit Powers reached him at 65,000 feet. The Valkyrie's planned cruise altitude sat at 70,000, a 5,000-foot margin. Soviet missile engineers weren't stupid, and they weren't standing still. The SA-2's engagement envelope expanded with every production upgrade. CIA technical assessments from late 1960 projected that improved variants could engage targets above 80,000 feet by 1965. The Valkyrie's speed advantage, Mach 3 versus the SA-2's Mach 3.5, meant the missile could still run it down from certain geometries, particularly head-on intercepts where closing speed exceeded 6 times the speed of sound. So, what changed in Washington? A young analyst named Alain Enthoven, working under McNamara in the Office of Systems Analysis, ran the penetration studies. His team modeled Soviet air defense improvements year by year, projecting SA-2 deployment density, radar coverage expansion, the introduction of newer systems like the SA-5 Gammon with its 100-mile range, and the hardening of command networks linking those batteries together. The classified assessment, portions declassified in 1997, concluded that by 1970, a B-70 flying its intended profile over the Soviet Union faced a probability of survival below 15% per sortie. Enthoven's office used the phrase operationally untenable. For a fleet of 200 bombers costing tens of billions, those numbers meant the entire investment could evaporate in a single coordinated strike mission. Al White, the Valkyrie's chief test pilot, felt it before the bureaucrats wrote their reports. He'd flown the aircraft at Mach 3 and understood viscerally what the analysts described abstractly. At 70,000 feet and 2,000 miles per hour, the Valkyrie couldn't maneuver. Banking into a 30-degree turn at that speed generated forces that pressed his chest into the seat, restraints hard enough to make breathing deliberate, each inhale a conscious act against the G-load squeezing his ribcage. The aircraft needed 80 miles of sky just to reverse course. Any SAM battery that acquired it had a target flying a predictable, nearly straight-line path with the turning radius of a freight train. Powers didn't kill the Valkyrie directly. He killed the idea that altitude equaled immunity. The British had learned something similar a decade earlier when Egyptian SA-2 batteries forced RAF Canberra reconnaissance flights down from high altitude during the Suez Crisis, though the details remained classified until the 1980s. By the summer of 1960, the Air Force's own internal advocates struggled to defend high-altitude penetration in briefings. LeMay kept fighting. He argued for a low-altitude dash variant, a modified mission profile that would take the B-70 under radar coverage for the final approach to target. The aerodynamic loads at Mach 1.1 near sea level would have stressed the airframe beyond its design limits. That proposal went nowhere. The records from those summer briefings are incomplete. Several key memoranda between LeMay and the air staff remain classified. How much is too much for an airplane nobody wants to fly into combat? McNamara's comptrollers ran the production estimates in early 1961. A fleet of 200 B-70s carried a unit cost of $750 million per aircraft in today's money. The total program, development, tooling, spare engines, ground support, dedicated tanker modifications, crew training pipelines, specialized JP-6 fuel logistics, crossed $100 billion, for a bomber that Enthoven's own office had assessed at 15% survivability. McNamara cut production to zero in March 1961. He kept 2 prototype airframes funded strictly as research vehicles. The XB-70 designation stayed, but the mission vanished. North American Aviation laid off 3,000 engineers in Inglewood over the following 6 months. LeMay reportedly called the decision criminal. The quote appears in 2 separate oral histories, but neither interviewer recorded it on tape. Sources conflict on the exact word. The French had faced a similar reckoning with their Dassault Mirage 4 bomber program around the same period, a supersonic nuclear delivery platform that consumed a disproportionate percentage of the force de frappe budget for an aircraft that could barely reach Soviet territory without multiple aerial refuelings. Paris kept building them anyway. McNamara had less patience for sentimentality. The 2 surviving Valkyries flew on as NASA research platforms, gathering supersonic transport data. Ship number 1, ship number 2. On June 8, 1966, both aircraft participated in a General Electric publicity photoshoot over the Mojave Desert, a formation flight with 4 other aircraft powered by GE engines. An F-104 starfighter piloted by Joe Walker drifted into the wake vortex, rolling off the Valkyrie's right wingtip. The vortex flipped Walker's aircraft inverted and drove it across the top of AV-2's fuselage, shearing off both vertical stabilizers. Walker died instantly. A V-2 entered a flat spin from 25,000 feet. Co-pilot Carl Cross never ejected. Pilot Al White triggered his escape capsule and survived with severe injuries, the clamshell doors crushing his arm as they closed around him, hydraulic pressure mashing flesh against the interior padding while the capsule tumbled through open sky. Cross rode the wreckage down for 47 seconds. The Air Force recovered his body from a crater north of Barstow. He carried no ejection injuries. The capsule mechanism had jammed. Ben Rich pulled a ball bearing from his pocket during a 1975 meeting at the Pentagon and rolled it across the conference table toward a room full of generals. "There's your radar cross-section," he said. The ball bearing measured less than half an inch in diameter. The aircraft he proposed to build stretched 50 feet wingtip to wingtip. While Cross's body cooled in the Mojave dirt and the surviving Valkyrie limped through its remaining test flights, the Strategic Air Command had already moved on. Minuteman silos punched into the Great Plains bedrock across Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas. By 1965, 800 Minuteman missiles sat on alert, each one carrying a warhead to target in 30 minutes. No crew survivability to worry about, no fuel logistics, no JP-6, no escape capsules that jammed. A Minuteman cost roughly $12 million per unit in 1965 money, 1/25th the price of a single B-70. McNamara's accountants had won, but ICBMs carried a problem the missile advocates never solved cleanly. You couldn't call them back. A bomber loitering at a fail-safe point over northern Canada could receive a recall code and turn home. A Minuteman 3 minutes into its boost phase belonged to physics. This mattered to strategists who spent their careers gaming scenarios where ambiguous intelligence triggered launch decisions under pressure. Thomas Schelling at Harvard called this the commitment problem. The very reliability of missiles made them dangerous in crises where de-escalation required flexibility. So, the bomber survived as a concept. The philosophy behind it changed completely. The Valkyrie's designers had tried to outrun Soviet defenses with speed and altitude. 14 years after McNamara killed that approach, Lockheed's Skunk Works proposed the opposite. Don't go faster, go invisible. Rich inherited the program from Kelly Johnson and drove his engineers toward an airframe that absorbed and deflected radar energy rather than trying to outpace the missiles it triggered. The math came from a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev, whose 1962 paper on electromagnetic wave diffraction had been published openly in Moscow because Soviet military reviewers considered it theoretically interesting but practically useless. Lockheed's engineers translated it and built an airplane around it. Dennis Overholzer, the mathematician who wrote the computer code converting Ufimtsev's equations into aircraft geometry, called his program Echo 1. The first shape it produced looked like a diamond, flat faceted panels arranged to bounce radar energy anywhere except back toward the transmitter. The results were so good we thought the software had a bug, Overholser told Lockheed's internal historians. They ran it again. Same answer. A properly faceted shape the size of a tactical aircraft returned a radar signature smaller than a hummingbird. Have Blue flew in December 1977. 2 subscale prototypes, both of which crashed during testing. The data held. Lockheed scaled the design up into the F-117 Nighthawk, and on January 17, 1991, Major Greg Feast dropped the first bomb of Operation Desert Storm through the roof of a telecommunications center in Baghdad. Iraqi radar operators never saw him. Their screens showed empty sky while 42,000 pounds of angular black aircraft passed overhead at 480 knots. The Soviets had spent 14 billion rubles on the MiG-25 to chase a bomber that flew at Mach 3. They built 2-digit SAM systems, the SA-10, SA-12, SA-20, optimized for high-speed, high-altitude intercepts. They wired half a continent with overlapping radar coverage tuned to detect fast-moving metal objects at extreme range. None of it mattered against an aircraft that didn't reflect radar. The same country that killed the Valkyrie spent 20 years figuring out why speed alone couldn't win, then built something the entire Soviet air defense network, every ruble, every radar, every interceptor, couldn't touch. It didn't fly higher or faster. It flew quiet. At 0900 hours on any given Tuesday, you can walk into the 4th building at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio, and stand underneath AV-1. Ship number 1, the surviving Valkyrie. It hangs there in climate-controlled air, 6 XJ-93 engines dormant, white paint oxidized to cream, canards fixed in their cruise position. The aircraft spans 105 feet nose to tail. Visitors photograph it from below with their phones tilted vertical, trying to fit the whole thing in frame. Most of them read the placard and move on to the SR-71 across the gallery. The airplane that sits in that museum accomplished something extraordinary by failing, or rather by being canceled. Viktor Belenko defected to Japan in September 1976, landing his MiG-25 at Hakodate Airport with almost no fuel remaining. Japanese and American intelligence teams disassembled the Foxbat over 67 days before returning it to the Soviets in crates. What they found irritated the analysts who'd spent a decade worrying about it. The MiG-25 used vacuum tubes in its radar, not because Soviet engineers lacked transistor technology, but because vacuum tubes survived electromagnetic pulse better, and the Foxbat's massive Smerch-A radar needed raw power over finesse. The airframe weighed 20 tons empty. Its wings couldn't sustain more than 5 Gs without permanent deformation. Belenko himself told debriefers the aircraft leaked fuel constantly. The cockpit pressurization failed above 40,000 feet on his particular jet, and pilots avoided pushing past Mach 2.8 because the engines ate themselves. The maintenance burden consumed 400 man-hours per flight hour. A Soviet assessment document captured in the early 1980s, declassified by the DIA in 2003, described Foxbat operational readiness rates as persistently below acceptable thresholds. Their word, not mine. 14 billion rubles, 400 man-hours per flight hour. Thousands of MiG-25 airframes rolling off the Gorky production line across 2 decades. Dedicated interceptor regiments stretched from Murmansk to Vladivostok. An entire layer of Soviet air defense doctrine oriented around killing a bomber that never entered production. The Valkyrie's cancellation didn't just save America $100 billion. It let the Soviet Union spend itself blind chasing a ghost. McNamara probably never framed it that way. His analysts cared about cost-effectiveness ratios and survivability percentages, not strategic deception. But the effect functioned identically. Every ruble Moscow poured into the Foxbat program drained resources from projects that might have addressed the threat that actually materialized. Low observable aircraft flying subsonic approaches through radar gaps the Soviets never closed because they'd optimized their network for high-fast targets. The SA-10 batteries, ringing Moscow, tracked beautifully at high altitude. Their pulse Doppler look-down capability against slow, small cross-section targets at medium altitude remained a known weakness through the late 1980s. The file on Soviet remediation efforts for that gap runs 11 pages. Most of it details procurement delays and funding shortfalls. So what killed them? Not the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie's absence killed them. They built the wrong defense against the wrong threat, then couldn't afford to pivot when the real one arrived. Greg Feast flew over Baghdad in January 1991, and Iraqi air defenses, Soviet-built, Soviet-designed, Soviet doctrine, performed exactly as the architecture allowed. The radar swept high and fast and found nothing. The Americans who won Desert Storm's opening minutes flew low, slow, and invisible. Everything the Valkyrie wasn't. Everything the MiG-25 couldn't catch because it had never been designed to look for it. On March 27, 1999, an F-117 piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko took a Serbian SA-3 missile through its left wing over Bujanovci. Colonel Zoltan Dani, commanding the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade, had figured out that stealth aircraft opened their bomb bay doors seconds before weapon release, briefly spiking their radar return. He repositioned his battery based on predicted ingress routes, modified his radar procedures, and waited. The shoot-down sent pieces of the F-117 scattering across Serbian farmland. Zelko ejected safely. The wreckage ended up in the Museum of Aviation in Belgrade, where it sits today, a crumpled black wing panel, angular facets still visible, mounted behind glass with a placard in Serbian and English. The aircraft America built because the Valkyrie died, killed by a missile system older than the bomber it replaced.